Your grandmother left everything to me," my sister Patricia announced with a smile that seemed far too satisfied for a day that was supposed to be about honoring the woman who raised us. The words hung in the air inside the attorney's office, and for a moment, nobody said anything. The ticking wall clock suddenly sounded louder than it had a second before. I looked down at my folded hands and nodded once, as though I had expected it all along. Maybe that was what surprised Patricia the most. She was waiting for an argument. She was waiting for tears. She was waiting for me to demand answers. Instead, I simply sat there. At 68 years old, I had learned that some truths reveal themselves only when you stop chasing them. The reading of Grandma Eleanor Bennett's estate had drawn together relatives I hadn't seen in years. Cousins filled the leather chairs along the wall. An aunt dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The scent of old paper and coffee lingered in the room. Outside the large windows, a gray Ohio afternoon settled over the town Grandma had called home for more than 50 years. Patricia sat across from me in a navy blazer, perfectly composed. She looked like someone accepting an award she believed she had earned. Attorney Martin Reynolds adjusted his glasses and continued reading through the remaining documents. According to the paperwork, Patricia would inherit Grandma's house, her savings accounts, and several investment funds. I would receive a small keepsake collection and a modest cash amount. It made little sense. For the last 7 years, I had driven nearly 40 miles each way to visit Grandma every weekend. I brought groceries. I helped organize medications. I sat with her through long afternoons when she wanted nothing more than company and conversation. Patricia rarely came. She always had a reason. Work, travel, commitments. Yet here we were. And somehow she had become the primary heir. Around the room, people exchanged quiet glances. No one wanted to say what they were thinking. Patricia finally broke the silence. "Grandma knew who she could trust," she said softly. The comment wasn't loud, but it was meant for me. I met her eyes and smiled politely. "Maybe she did," I replied. That seemed to disappoint her. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Family members drifted into the hallway, whispering among themselves. Patricia accepted hugs and congratulations with practiced grace. I gathered my purse and prepared to leave. The grief of losing Grandma still weighed heavier on me than any discussion about money ever could. I was halfway to the door when I heard someone call my name. "Margaret." I turned. Attorney Reynolds stood near his office entrance, holding a thin manila folder against his chest. His expression was careful, thoughtful, different from before. "Would you stay for just a moment?" he asked quietly. Something in his voice made me pause. When the last relative disappeared down the hallway and the office fell silent, he closed the door behind us. Then he looked at me and said words that would change everything. "There may be one more document your grandmother wanted you to see." Attorney Reynolds remained standing beside his desk for several seconds after speaking, as if he was deciding how much he should say. I could hear the faint hum of traffic outside and the distant sound of an elevator door opening somewhere down the hall. The office that had felt crowded only minutes earlier now seemed strangely quiet. I tightened my grip on my purse and waited. At my age, I had learned that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. "What kind of document?" I finally asked. Reynolds glanced toward the closed door before lowering his voice. "I do not know exactly what it contains. I only know your grandmother instructed me to contact you if certain circumstances occurred." My stomach tightened. "Certain circumstances?" He nodded. "She was very specific." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The image of Grandma Eleanor filled my mind. Even in her late 80s, she had possessed a sharpness that made people underestimate her at their own risk. She noticed everything. Every glance. Every hesitation. Every unspoken tension at family gatherings. She rarely confronted people directly, but she remembered everything. Reynolds opened a drawer and removed a small notepad. 3 weeks. Before she passed away, your grandmother came here alone. She asked several unusual questions about estate records and personal declarations. Then she left instructions regarding a sealed item. I felt my pulse quicken. "Where is it?" He shook his head. "That is the problem. The item was never deposited with my office." I stared at him. "Then how do you know it exists?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Because your grandmother wanted to make certain someone would look for it." Those words followed me all the way home. The drive back to my small colonial house took almost 40 minutes. Gray clouds hung low across the Ohio sky, and a light rain began tapping against my windshield. I barely noticed. My thoughts remained fixed on Grandma, on the possibility that she had anticipated something long before the rest of us. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon had faded into evening. The front porch looked exactly as it always had. 2 rocking chairs, a hanging fern, the brass wind chime Grandma had given me 10 years earlier. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house felt empty, not lonely, just still. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for several moments. Patricia's confident smile returned to my mind. So did the way she had accepted congratulations before the meeting was even over. It was as if she had never doubted the outcome. That realization unsettled me more than the inheritance itself. I made a cup of tea and carried it into the living room. On the bookshelf sat a framed photograph taken 15 years earlier. Grandma stood between Patricia and me at a summer picnic. Patricia was smiling at the camera. I was laughing at something Grandma had said. Looking at that picture now, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. Grandma was not looking at the camera. She was looking directly at Patricia, and there was something thoughtful in her expression, something watchful. I sat down slowly and stared at the photograph until the tea grew cold. That was when I realized this story had not started at the attorney's office. It had started long before Grandma died. The next morning I woke before sunrise, unable to shake the feeling that I had overlooked something important for years. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window as I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood looking out at the backyard. The maple tree Grandma loved was beginning to lose its leaves. She used to sit beneath it every autumn and tell stories about family members I had never met. Back then I thought she was simply sharing memories. Now I wondered if she had been teaching me how to recognize patterns. By mid-morning, I found myself pulling old photo albums from the hall closet. 1 box became 2, then 3. Dust covered my hands as I carried everything into the living room. At first, I was only searching for comfort, for reminders of happier years. Instead, I started noticing details that had never seemed important before. In photograph after photograph, Grandma and I appeared together at birthdays, church picnics, holiday dinners, and ordinary afternoons on her front porch. Patricia appeared far less often. I paused over a picture taken 8 years earlier during Grandma's 81st birthday celebration. I remembered that day clearly because Patricia had arrived nearly 2 hours late. At the time, she blamed traffic. Looking at the photo now, I remembered something else. Grandma had seemed disappointed long before Patricia ever walked through the door. Another memory surfaced. 5 years ago, Grandma asked for help organizing her financial records. I spent an entire Saturday sorting folders at her dining room table. Patricia had promised to come. She never did. Then there was the winter storm 3 years earlier. Roads were covered in ice. The temperature dropped below 20 degrees. Grandma lost power for nearly 12 hours. I drove there anyway with blankets and groceries. Patricia called to say she did not want to risk the roads. None of those moments felt significant at the time. Families are complicated. People become busy. Excuses are easy to accept when you want peace more than answers. Around noon, my telephone rang. The caller identification showed Patricia's name. I stared at the screen until the ringing stopped. A minute later, a voicemail notification appeared. I listened. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Just checking on you. Yesterday was emotional for everyone. Let us not let money come between us. I almost laughed. Money had not come between us. Something else had. Something I was only beginning to understand. Later that afternoon, I drove to Grandma's house. The property now technically belonged to Patricia, but the locks had not been changed yet. The familiar white farmhouse stood exactly as it always had. A rocking chair rested on the front porch. Wind chimes moved gently in the breeze. Everything looked ordinary. Yet as I stepped inside, I felt as though the house itself was waiting for someone to notice what had been hidden in plain sight. And standing in the quiet living room, surrounded by decades of memories, I suddenly remembered the last private conversation Grandma and I had shared 1 month before she passed away. Standing in Grandma's living room, I could almost hear her voice again. The memory arrived so clearly that it felt less like a recollection and more like stepping backward through time. It had been exactly 1 month before she passed away. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the hardwood floor. Grandma sat in her favorite armchair with a blanket folded neatly across her lap. Her silver hair was perfectly brushed, and despite her age, her eyes remained as sharp as ever. I had brought her lunch from the small diner she loved on Main Street. We spent nearly an hour talking about ordinary things. The weather, the church bake sale, a neighbor who had finally repaired a broken fence. Then the conversation shifted. Grandma became unusually quiet. She stared toward the window for several moments before speaking. "Margaret, have you ever noticed how people behave differently when they think nobody is watching?" I smiled and told her that was a strange question. She smiled back, but did not laugh. "I am serious." There was something thoughtful in her expression, something careful. I sat down across from her and listened. Over the years I had learned that when Grandma chose her words slowly, it usually meant they mattered. She folded her hands together and looked directly at me. "Some people show you who they are when life becomes difficult. Others show you who they are when money becomes involved." I remember feeling slightly uncomfortable. Family conversations rarely went in that direction. "Is this about Patricia?" I asked. Grandma did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her teacup and took a small sip. "This is about choices," she said at last. "People make them every day. Eventually, those choices become character." At the time, I thought she was simply reflecting on life. Looking back now, I realized she was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. The memory continued unfolding piece by piece. Before I left that afternoon, Grandma asked me to retrieve a small wooden box from the bookshelf in her study. It was old and scratched along the edges. I handed it to her, expecting her to open it. Instead, she rested one hand on top of it and smiled. "Some things are worth protecting until the right moment arrives." I remember laughing softly and asking if she was talking about family secrets. "Maybe," she replied. Then she changed the subject completely. At the time, the exchange seemed harmless. Now, standing in the same house weeks after her funeral, I felt a chill run through me. My eyes moved across the room toward the hallway leading to her study. Suddenly, I realized exactly where that wooden box had been sitting. And for the first time since Attorney Reynolds mentioned the missing document, I believed I knew where to begin looking. The study looked exactly as it had the last time I saw Grandma sitting behind her desk. The scent of old books still lingered in the air. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating rows of family photographs and shelves filled with journals she had collected over decades. For a moment, I simply stood there. Grief has a strange way of disguising itself. Sometimes it arrives as sadness. Other times it arrives as silence. I walked slowly toward the bookshelf where I remembered seeing the wooden box. The space was empty. My heart sank. I checked the lower shelves. Then the cabinet beneath the window. Nothing. Dust coated my fingertips as I searched. Every drawer contained ordinary things. Stationery, receipts, old greeting cards. Yet I could not shake the feeling that Grandma had left me a trail. She had always loved puzzles. Not complicated puzzles with pieces missing, but the kind that required patience. The kind that rewarded observation. After nearly an hour, I sat down in her desk chair and looked around the room again. That was when I noticed something unusual. On the wall beside the bookshelf hung a framed photograph of our family, taken nearly 20 years earlier. I had seen it hundreds of times, but now it appeared slightly crooked. The frame tilted just enough to catch my attention. I stood and adjusted it. As I did, I heard a faint sound behind the wall. A small tap. Not loud, just enough to make me pause. Carefully, I lifted the photograph from its hook. Behind it was a narrow wooden panel nearly identical to the surrounding wall. My pulse quickened. I pressed gently against one corner. The panel shifted. Hidden behind it was a shallow compartment. Inside sat the very wooden box Grandma had asked me to retrieve a month before she passed away. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it out. The box felt heavier than I expected. The brass latch remained locked. I searched the compartment again and found a folded note tucked into the corner. Written in Grandma's familiar handwriting were 6 simple words. "The key is where kindness lives." I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. "The key is where kindness lives." It sounded exactly like something Grandma would write. Not a direct instruction. A clue. A lesson hidden inside a puzzle. I carried the box into the living room and sat on her old sofa. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, the house remained perfectly still. My thoughts raced through every room, every object, every memory connected to her. Kindness. What place had mattered most to Grandma? The answer arrived almost immediately. The church. For more than 40 years, she volunteered at St. Matthew's Community Pantry every Thursday morning. She called it her favorite place in town because it reminded her that small acts could change lives. I looked down at the box resting on my lap. If my instinct was correct, the next clue was waiting there. And for the first time since the attorney's office, I felt certain I was moving closer to whatever truth Grandma had spent so much effort protecting. The following morning, I drove to St. Matthew's Community Pantry before it opened. The church sat on the edge of town, its red brick walls glowing softly beneath the early sunlight. I had not visited since Grandma's memorial service 2 weeks earlier. As I stepped out of my car, memories returned immediately. Grandma carrying boxes of canned food. Grandma greeting volunteers by name. Grandma insisting that every person deserved dignity regardless of circumstance. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and old wood filled the hallway. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the pantry director, looked surprised to see me. She wrapped me in a warm embrace and asked how I was holding up. We spoke quietly for several minutes. Then I explained that I was trying to follow a clue Grandma had left behind. Mrs. Carter smiled at that. "That sounds exactly like Eleanor," she said. "She always believed people should earn important answers." I showed her the note. "The key is where kindness lives." She read the sentence and immediately became thoughtful. Then her eyes widened slightly. "Wait here." She disappeared into a storage room and returned carrying a small metal cash box. "Your grandmother asked me to keep this safe several months ago," she explained. "She told me someone would eventually come looking for it. She never said who." My pulse quickened. The box was old, but carefully maintained. Attached to the handle was a small envelope with my name written in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single note. "Margaret, if you are reading this, it means you remembered where kindness lives. I always knew you would. The key you need is inside the pantry recipe book. Trust your memories. Love, Grandma." For a moment I could not speak. Mrs. Carter led me toward a shelf near the kitchen. Hundreds of recipe binders sat neatly arranged, collected from church members over decades. Finding the correct one took only a few minutes. Tucked between 2 pages was a small brass key. My hands trembled as I held it. It matched the size of the lock on the wooden box perfectly. Mrs. Carter looked at me with curiosity, but she did not ask questions. She simply squeezed my hand and wished me luck. I drove home with the key in one pocket and the wooden box secured beside me. Every traffic light seemed to last forever. Every mile felt longer than usual. By the time I reached my driveway, anticipation had replaced uncertainty. I carried the box into my living room and placed it carefully on the coffee table. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The house was completely silent. I sat down and stared at the brass latch for several seconds. Then I inserted the key. The lock clicked open immediately. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside rested 3 items. A sealed letter addressed to me, a flash drive labeled family record, and a folded document bearing Grandma's signature. The moment I saw them, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. Grandma had known exactly what was going to happen, and she had spent months preparing for it. For several minutes, I simply stared at the contents of the box. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the living room floor, but I barely noticed. My attention remained fixed on the letter. Grandma's handwriting covered the front of the envelope in careful blue ink. My name, nothing else. I opened it slowly and unfolded several pages. The first line alone made my breath catch. "Margaret, if this letter has reached you, then events unfolded exactly as I feared they might." I read every word twice. Then a third time. Grandma explained that during the last few years of her life, she had quietly reviewed her finances, legal records, and family affairs. What she discovered troubled her deeply. Without naming anyone immediately, she described repeated attempts to influence decisions about her estate, requests that certain accounts be changed, suggestions that some family members deserved more than others. Subtle pressure disguised as concern. As I continued reading, the picture became clearer. Grandma wrote that she had kept detailed records of every conversation, every document, every recommendation made regarding her assets. Then I reached the paragraph that changed everything. Patricia, she wrote, had repeatedly encouraged her to alter estate arrangements while claiming it would simplify matters for the family. Grandma admitted that at first she considered some of those suggestions reasonable, but over time, inconsistencies began appearing. Statements that did not match facts. Stories that changed depending on the audience. Information presented in ways designed to create misunderstandings. Grandma never accused Patricia of anything dramatic. That was not her style. Instead, she documented behavior. Dates, notes, observations, calm facts, the kind that are difficult to dismiss. My hands trembled as I set the letter down and picked up the folded document. It was signed and notarized. Attached behind it was a detailed statement prepared months before Grandma passed away. The document explained that she intentionally created two versions of her estate instructions. One version was intended to reveal who respected her wishes. The other preserved her actual intentions. I felt my pulse quicken. Then I turned to the flash drive. My old laptop sat on a side table beside the sofa. I inserted the drive and opened the only video file it contained. The screen flickered. Then Grandma appeared. She sat in the same armchair from her living room, wearing her favorite light blue cardigan. She smiled gently into the camera. "If you are watching this, Margaret, then I was right to trust you." Tears filled my eyes instantly. Hearing her voice again felt impossible. She continued speaking calmly. She explained how carefully she had observed everyone during her final years. She spoke about integrity, about patience, about character revealed through small choices. Then she addressed the estate directly. She stated clearly that her true wishes were contained in the notarized document accompanying the recording. She wanted every family member to hear her explanation in her own words. No confusion, no interpretation, no manipulation, only the truth. When the video ended, the room fell silent once more. I sat, motionless, staring at the dark screen. Patricia believed the story had already been decided. But now I understood something she did not. Grandma had spent months preparing for this exact moment. And soon, the entire family was going to learn why. The family meeting took place 4 days later in the same attorney's office where everything had seemingly been decided. Attorney Reynolds arranged the gathering himself after reviewing the documents from the box. He was careful with every detail, careful with every phone call, careful with every invitation. By the time I arrived that afternoon, nearly every relative who had attended the original estate reading was already there. Conversations filled the room. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Coffee cups rested on side tables. Patricia sat near the front wearing the same confident expression I had come to recognize. She greeted relatives warmly and accepted their attention as though nothing had changed. When she noticed me enter, she smiled politely. "I am glad you came," she said. "I think it is time everyone moved forward." I returned the smile. "I agree." Something about my answer seemed to unsettle her. Attorney Reynolds waited until everyone was seated before standing. The room gradually fell silent. He explained that new materials connected to Grandma's estate had been discovered and required formal review. Immediately, I noticed Patricia straighten in her chair. Her expression tightened slightly. "What materials?" she asked. Reynolds did not answer right away. Instead, he connected a laptop to a large television mounted on the wall. My heart began beating faster. Around the room, relatives exchanged confused glances. Then the screen flickered to life. Grandma appeared. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed throughout the room. One cousin covered her mouth. My aunt began quietly crying. Even Patricia seemed frozen. For several moments, nobody spoke. Grandma smiled gently from the screen, just as she had in my living room days earlier. Then she began speaking. Her voice filled the room with calm certainty. She explained that she wanted her family to hear directly from her. She spoke about honesty, about gratitude, about the importance of character when difficult decisions must be made. Then she addressed her estate. She described concerns that had developed over several years. She explained that certain conversations regarding money and inheritance had caused her to create additional safeguards. Not because she wished to punish anyone, because she wished to protect the truth. The room remained completely silent. Every eye stayed fixed on the screen. Grandma then referenced the notarized document accompanying the recording. Attorney Reynolds distributed copies. As pages turned, expressions around the room began changing. Confusion gave way to realization. Realization gave way to shock. The document clearly outlined Grandma's actual intentions. It also contained detailed notes supporting those decisions. Notes she had personally prepared and verified. Across the room, Patricia's confidence slowly disappeared. For the first time since Grandma's passing, she looked uncertain, truly uncertain. Yet nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The evidence spoke for itself. When the video finally ended, silence settled over the office once again. Attorney Reynolds folded his hands and looked around the room. "I believe Eleanor Bennett has made her wishes very clear," he said quietly. And at that moment, every person present understood that the story they thought had ended days earlier was only now reaching the truth. The weeks that followed moved more quietly than I expected. There were meetings with attorneys, paperwork to review, and formal updates to Grandma's estate records. Everything was handled professionally and carefully. The notarized document and video left little room for confusion. Grandma's actual wishes were honored exactly as she intended. The farmhouse, the investment accounts, and several family heirlooms were distributed according to the instructions she had protected so carefully. Yet as important as those assets were, they no longer felt like the center of the story. Something far more valuable had already been restored. The truth. I thought I would feel victorious. I thought I would experience some great sense of satisfaction. Instead, I felt calm. One afternoon, I returned to the farmhouse alone. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and sunlight filtered through the trees lining the driveway. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything looked familiar. The rocking chair beside the fireplace, the framed photographs along the hallway, the grandfather clock that had marked family milestones for decades. I walked slowly from room to room, remembering birthdays, holiday dinners, and quiet afternoons spent talking with Grandma over tea. In the study, I sat behind her desk and opened the final page of her letter once more. There was one paragraph I had not been able to stop thinking about. "Margaret, if you learn anything from all of this, let it be this. Money reveals character, but it is not character itself. A person's true inheritance is the way they treat others when no reward is guaranteed." I read the words several times. Then I folded the letter and placed it carefully back into its envelope. Outside the study window, the maple tree swayed gently in the breeze. For a moment, it felt as though Grandma was still teaching me. Patricia and I spoke only once after the family meeting. The conversation was brief and polite. There were no dramatic confrontations, no speeches, no attempts to revisit the past. Some distances cannot be measured in miles. They are measured in choices, and those choices had already been made. As winter approached, I began volunteering at St. Matthew's Community Pantry every Thursday morning, the same place Grandma had loved for so many years. I organized donations, stocked shelves, and greeted visitors the way she always had. Sometimes people thanked me. Sometimes they did not. It did not matter. I finally understood why she had treasured that place. Kindness leaves a different kind of legacy, one that cannot be listed in a will or stored in a bank account. Several months later, Attorney Reynolds mailed me a final copy of the completed estate records. I placed the envelope in a drawer without opening it immediately. Then I walked onto my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sunrise spread across the quiet Ohio countryside. The farmhouse was peaceful. My heart was peaceful too. In the end, the greatest gift Grandma left behind was never the property, the savings, or the documents hidden inside a wooden box. It was the reminder that truth may take time to emerge, but it does emerge. And when it finally does, it has a way of finding exactly the people who need it most.